Hi there. This is a continuation of a really great session we had with the folks at NBTA. They organized a question and answer session with teachers from around the province. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and we had a lot of comments that teachers enjoyed it. And we didn't get to cover all the questions. So we took everything that was submitted that we didn't get to, and for teachers who are still interested in some of the answers, we're going to cover all of them now so that we can actually say we answered every question that was important to teachers in New Brunswick. So let's get her going.
All right, so the first question is what measures can be put in place to assist teachers dealing with violent students?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is one thing our office is going to always be big on is saying let's go back, because of course we are an office built to advocate for children. And we get a lot of these files. We investigate a lot of them. And one of the first things it's our job to do is hold the system accountable, starting at the top, for what got us here. And those can sometimes be uncomfortable questions because they often speak to some of the same things that teachers see every day. A lack of resources, lack of planning, lack of proper assessments in time. But it is our job to ask that. So the very first thing we're going to say is, if there has been, and there most certainly has been, an increase in the number of violent incidents in schools, why is that happening? And so we're not going to just join the conversation and say, well, gee, let's just talk about what to do here. I recognize in saying that for a lot of teachers, somebody has to deal with that. I'm going to get there. But here are some of the most common flaws when we get these files that we have to continue to hold the department and the district leadership accountable for. Failure to have proper assessments in time. The wait list for ed psych assessments is way too long. Way too often, teachers and other educators are sent into violent situations and told to do their best when there isn't anyone in the room who is working from proper information and assessments. And that's not legal. The Supreme Court was very clear, and it's been a lot of years now. The department and district has had a lot of time. There's a decision out of British Columbia called the Moore decision, and Newfoundland had a human rights decision called the Churchill decision. Both of them were very clear that if there is a professional assessment done, it is the district and department's job to provide the resources to implement it without some proper reasoning why. And it can't just be we didn't have the money or we didn't want to. If a child is waiting for an assessment, then it is the obligation, if those people are not available within the public system, they have to find those resources in the private system. And when people say we don't have the money, interesting thing, as will be coming out in a new report of ours, we've discovered that when school psychology and other positions aren't filled, the department withholds the money. That money should be going to provide for private assessments so teachers and other frontline professionals have the resources they need. So right off the bat, I'm going to say the best thing to do when it comes to helping teachers deal with violent incidents is to stop having so many violent incidents that occur because we didn't intervene when children were young, smaller, and more able to receive help. Now, when it does happen, obviously there are a number of important things. One is, look, who are you consulting? Are you getting access in a timely way to somebody who can explain what's going on? Are you getting access to somebody who can provide the right kind of training? I do have to say, I get worried when people say, well, should the advocate tell me how to deal with violent students? If teachers are having to, and I accept it's come to that, if teachers are having to ask the advocate how to deal with violent students in the classroom, somewhere there's been a failure of leadership at the district and department level. And those resources should absolutely be available. But I'm going to return to this. Step one for us is always going to be, did the department and district meet their legal obligation to get timely assessments, to follow them, to provide intensive resources early on when children can most benefit from the help? And once it happens, if the child can't be managed in the regular classroom, then did they find a targeted, therapeutic, and effective way, even if it costs more in the short term, to provide them help? Just sending a child out of the classroom on a rotating basis to simply come back with no additional services and no real reason to believe things will change is disruptive to other students, dangerous for teachers, and not helpful to the student.
So the next question is, how can the advocate's office work to prevent chronic absenteeism and hold parents accountable for attendance issues? Why is it not part of social development's protocol to follow up with attendance concerns and ensure child safety?
This question raises a couple of really important issues. And I should be clear, one thing that I did get a chance to say in the session we had, the advocate's office isn't part of government. The advocate's office is a government watchdog, an independent office that reports directly to the Legislative Assembly to tell legislators whether or not the people running the education system are following the laws that were passed by the legislature and whether or not there are problems that are impacting children. So the advocate's office isn't going to be, with our small staff of 20, a source of solving those problems, but we are here to make sure that we hold people accountable for the resource decisions and for the procedural decisions that happen. And I think there's a couple of things this raises. One, is it social development's protocol to follow up with attendance concerns? Well, it is supposed to be. There have been issues in the past where social development protocols haven't been followed. There's no question about that. And if you see that, one thing I would urge teachers to do, you can, without disclosing your identity, contact the advocate's office and we will look into that. And we will make sure that people are accountable for quick follow-ups because teachers shouldn't be left to struggle with situations that are difficult to control without every department doing their job. And that's absolutely important. Attendance concerns, I know that I see the numbers and I understand that's a real concern. And I'm going to urge people to do something important. If you want to address a problem, the first thing is to say, well, where did it start and what can we identify might have changed? So we know that attendance concerns started spiking about 5 years ago. Certainly we know the pandemic was part of it, but we're seeing much higher numbers. So I would look at a number of things to hold all of us accountable for what we can do to improve attendance. One is, I don't think there's going to be a hard and fast answer that will work for every student. What protocols and procedures are in place at the school level to explore what is driving that? Is it necessarily a home issue? Is it a mental health issue? Is it a student who's doing well but has simply become disengaged with the material? Is there a different program that might help? Schools that provide more engaging material, schools that allow children to learn in more independent ways, schools that provide more practical hands-on opportunities to older students tends to work. One of the most interesting things I remember learning when I was an educator is I had a mentor named Chip Anderson. He was the real guru of student services, and he wrote a book called Strengths Quest, which was a strengths-based approach. And he said, I used to work a lot with students who were struggling or not attending school, and I used to poke them and prod them and question them and give them evaluations and ask what's wrong with you. But then I thought I was doing it wrong. So I went back and I started evaluating the students who were succeeding, who were showing up, who were enjoying school. And I asked them a different question. What's right with you? And he found the single greatest predictor of a child's attendance and persistence in school was not the absence of problems, but the presence of motivation. If children know what they want to achieve at school and they see a direct link between the program and what they want, then that motivation will be there. If a child doesn't know why they're attending, if a child doesn't see a link between something they care about and something and attending, then even small problems will tend to knock them out of the system. So I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all answer, but what I would always say to any school is what are the supports we're giving teachers to know what the student story is, what motivates them, why do they want to come? And yes, quick access to mental health services could be part of the solution. Quick access to any number of services can help, but the real question, if a child isn't going to school, starts with why not? And what is it that the child isn't seeing there? And I think having a system that naturally asks those questions is important in any school.
Do you believe it's appropriate to develop an alternate setting program housed within the physical school building?
I believe in policy 322. And I think, again, we have to always be careful with these questions to not to jump to, well, here we are, we have an older student who's got a lot of problems. What do we do with that? And it's always going to be our job to go back and say, did we make sure that this child was well served? What I do believe very strongly is that every child should be able to find something they love to do and are good at. They should be able to get interventions in a timely way, that if people are unsure what interventions to do, teachers should have access to proper assessments. And all of those things right now, let's be honest, the resources are not being put in. In some cases, the department is actually withholding some of the very resources that should be there. And that's an issue that we're going to be tackling in our next report. Every child should be able to learn in the common learning environment. Now, what is your common learning environment? If, for example, you have a more decentralized instructional style, if children are doing more independent projects, if there's more opportunity for inquiry-based learning, the common learning environment is going to grow. That is one area of solutions. I also think it's really important that we always understand what inclusive education means. It does not mean that every child is necessarily in the same classroom, learning the same way at all times, regardless of outcomes. Short-term, targeted therapeutic interventions that meet a child's unique needs, that allow them to get the help they need in return to the common learning environment, are always going to be okay. Right now, one thing we have raised in our reports is there isn't always a way for teachers to know how to access those resources. There isn't always a really good way for teachers to signal that a child is not thriving and to say, we have to do something differently. And look, we're always going to be of the position that simply refusing to act for a number of years and then saying, let's just send the child out of the classroom, that's not going to work. And I know that's hard when teachers often, they aren't the ones who follow the student for all those years. They're confronted with a problem, and the problems are very real. But it is our job to hold the system accountable, and it can't just be, well, we didn't feel like spending the money early, so now when there's problems, we need to make children disappear into another environment. The system has to be accountable for intervening early, for having proper assessments. And as children get older, I think what's equally important is making sure that every child should have a program that speaks to their strengths and interests, to their learning styles, have opportunities for independent exploration, independent inquiry, more group work, more decentralized things. Those are things that, in some ways, if the classroom can't accommodate people without saying, well, maybe every child who's a little different should go somewhere else, maybe we need to talk about what's the classroom instructional style as well. And those are issues of supports, interventions, and professional development. And we are going to push for those. But, one thing that our office isn't going to be okay with is just saying, well, let's not talk about how we got here. Let's just make this problem go away. Part of our job is to ask the uncomfortable questions about, well, how did we get here? And so that doesn't mean the advocate's office isn't sensitive to the incredible work and the incredible challenges teachers are meeting every day. But it does mean our job is to make sure that the child's voice is heard. That sometimes means going back and saying, how could we have done that differently? And that role is also part of making sure there's real change that we all want, which is having the resources and the timely interventions that actually help teachers do the things that most of us probably got into the profession to do.
Does the advocate investigate group homes in relation to student behavioral issues?
The advocate has full power to investigate group homes for any number of issues. One thing to always remember, we are the child advocate's office. So we exist to make sure that children who often don't have a voice, vulnerable kids in group homes don't have a provincial association that speaks for them. They don't have union leadership. They don't donate to political campaigns. We have full authority to investigate group homes, and any teacher who is concerned that any child isn't getting the service they need in a group home should let the advocate's office know immediately.
How can we handle parents insisting on children being placed in partial day plans, even though the school believes they can be successful attending full days?
If I was asked that question, and as somebody senior in the educational system, I think my first question would be, well, why are they doing that? I don't think there's going to be an easy answer to any of those things in the abstract. Very often, we are seeing some files where parents are choosing partial days because the alternative is the overuse of a seclusion room. And often when we scratch the surface on those files, those go back to The same problems we talked about before. You know, the province recently lost an arbitration uh, on regarding working conditions for teachers, and teachers and the other educators who raised those issues were absolutely right to do that. But when you read the arbitration, it's important to see what that arbitrator said had gone wrong. That for years, even though this child's behavior was escalating, becoming more violent and more dangerous, nobody authorized the additional expense of getting an outside assessment. Nobody asked whether the people in the room had the right mix of skills or the right information to know what to do. Nobody said, hey, this child's progress is backsliding. Should we be doing more intensive interventions? And so making sure that those systemic accountabilities are there for the people who have the authority to give those resources is absolutely essential. And so I am seeing some files where parents may be saying, I'll accept partial days. I think any question I would be able to be helpful on would have to say, well, what alternative was offered? And if the alternative is my child's going to be in a seclusion room half the time, or my child doesn't have a way to get an assessment, or nobody's listening to me, I think we have to always say, anytime a parent is giving us an answer that may appear frustrating or irrational, what what alternatives were they given and where is the child at? And so what, and I'm sure folks know this, obviously, I'm not going to have a great answer to that without seeing the entire file. What I can tell you is the kind of questions that should be asked. What is the parent responding to? What options they have? And do those correspond with the law? Are we seeing children get what the province has been told to their own expense they need to start doing, which is more timely assessments, more help for teachers, more access to expert help? Those are the kinds of things we all have to advocate for, because we can't just say, look, let's ignore the last 8 or 9 years that nobody did anything and then make the child disappear. We've got to all insist that people who have the power to provide more timely resources do it.
What are your thoughts on up and outs? How do we account for the harm caused to students who are being constantly displaced?
I think anytime you have repeated up and outs, the question that teachers have to be empowered to ask is, okay, if we're not going to repeat the same behavior, what are we doing differently? And that is, again, something that we're seeing a lot of files. The arbitrator saw one in that decision that senior leadership at the department level is not good at doing, which is providing a way to say, this is occurring over and over. We need to escalate this to a point where we get proper evaluations and proper plan, and sometimes targeted therapeutic services outside of the common learning environment that give the child the skills they need. When I see a file that has say 5 or 6 up and outs in a month, I'm always going to go back, and I hope teachers are given the freedom by the district to do that. Too often, I think, again, we come into the movie and somebody says, well, what do we do now? And the answer is always has to be, well, what were we doing before this? If a child has 2 or 3 up and outs in a week, that should be an emergency situation. I like to believe it is. I naively, before I started this job, thought it would be. But often it seems to be either send the child home with no services or limited services, have them come back for a few minutes a day, now having been outside of the common learning environment, more anxious in returning, and then be surprised that the same thing happens again. Senior leadership in the system always has to be accountable for the question, if the outcome was not acceptable, what changed so that we predict a different outcome when the child returns? And so, again, there's nothing wrong with looking at, if a child is causing a number of up and outs, that is a prima facie case of undue hardship. A lack of resources is an undue hardship, but disruption of other students' learning environment or violence to other children or teachers or any educator, that is undue hardship. And that is a reason to use Section 8 of the Act, which says that you can provide for a child to receive services in a different learning environment as long as it has a proper evaluation It has a real plan based on giving them the skills they need to return to the classroom and the resources to deliver it. That's all anybody's asked for. And one thing we are starting to work now with NBTF on is there should be both a clear protocol for teachers to have a way to report those situations and a fund where those additional resources needed can actually be applied. So look, I know it's sometimes going to be frustrating that my office comes in and says, well, how did we get here? But that's the question that has to be asked every time. And what will not be acceptable is simply saying, well, this didn't work, and we don't feel like spending any money or having additional resources or finding an evaluator. We're just going to send the kid home, bring them back, and see if something different happens. And too often that's happening, and it's putting teachers at risk. It's disrupting other kids' learning. Our goal is to solve it, but the solution isn't going to come by saying to the system, look, if you didn't do your job, just make the kid disappear. The only way it's going to change is if the system has an incentive to intervene early. And the incentive to intervene early has to be do it now or it gets more expensive later. And if just disappearing kids is an option, then the system has no incentive to change, and that doesn't help anybody, including teachers. So that's my answer. Up and out shouldn't be repeated. Should interventions and resources intensify when they happen? Yes. If the interventions and resources don't intensify, our offices like ours could ask, why not? Yeah, we are, because that's the only way we're going to break this cycle.
How can we address the lack of accountability for stakeholders within the ISD model?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's a problem. If you read reports like How It All Broke, you'll find one thing I have tried to make the system mindful of is anytime there's a failed governance model, I'll say, well, what are people's incentives to do differently? Right now, departments work in silos and they're heavily rule-based. They don't measure a lot of outcomes, but they do measure compliance to rules. So that's a problem in a system like integrated services, which is the idea that departments like health, social development, education, public safety, if it's applicable, should be coordinating services, making sure the child gets the service first, and we fight about which department pays for it out of their budget later. And right now, government isn't built for collaboration because there are no incentives to do it. We don't measure outcomes and we don't hold people accountable for them. We do make them accountable for following rules. So if someone at health or social development is presented with a case that's going to be expensive or difficult to fix or going to require more intensive interventions, there's two big disincentives to collaborating. One, right now the system actually rewards people for staying within their budget, but doesn't measure whether or not they contributed to the outcome. So if you save your department $5, but you pass a $100,000 problem onto the school, then you've technically done your job. And until somebody at the center of government, and that's probably where this answer is going, until somebody at the center of government changes that incentive system to say everybody is going to be rewarded for getting the right outcome, then we're not going to see a change in that behavior. And teachers pay the biggest price of all for that. Because in the end, we often have a system where the bus delivers the student to the school every single day, and the teacher is the one who has the incentive to do something. And that's why we're seeing too many files where the teacher and the school are begging for help, and the departments with the resources at health and social development are forming a committee to study whether or not they can find a way to do it, or saying, well, we're going to send that budget back for reconsideration because it's $2 an hour too much to get that staff person in the home who might help. So what we have suggested is, one, the center of government needs to take it over, as it was done originally when integrated service delivery was first created, coming out of Bernard Richard reports in 2008. At that time, the government said a senior minister reporting to the premier will be accountable for making the system work, and there will be an ADM level person who answers that minister. In 2015, government got away from that. 2015, government began saying, well, just every department will have its own director level person, and they'll just meet and work it out. All that did was throw departments back in the same room where everyone just had an incentive to guard their budgets, and everything got slow and teachers paid the price. I am hopeful that from the discussions we've had with the folks at the center of government, the Executive Council office, the Premier's office, that we are going to soon start seeing a model where there are actual measures for how quickly other departments respond. They will be expected to do it. We will have principles that you provide the service first and settle who pays for it later. Those are the kinds of reforms at the center of government that have to work. And I think the question is absolutely right when we say the lack of accountability for stakeholders. Teachers are accountable every day because the child shows up and they have to do something. Other departments don't have that urgency placed on them by the center of government, and the model has to change to do that.
What can we do to improve mental health supports for students, particularly with regard to counselor-student ratios?
One thing we could do is follow the law. The Department of Education, for reasons that I have not heard a satisfactory explanation for, continue to have a process that says if a district doesn't fill a hard to recruit position, speech pathologist or mental or psychologist or others, then the money just gets withheld. Frankly, if that money's there to support students, the law is already clear. If the public system can't provide the evaluation, the school still needs it. It should be going to somewhere where there can be a private evaluation provided, and that money should be made available to the district to do it, or to provide other professionals who can, at least in the judgment of the district, fill some of that gap. So that reform alone would make a huge difference. There's also no doubt that we are seeing an explosion in the number of students reporting depression, anxiety, and any number of mental health issues. And we have urged going back to the root causes on that. One thing that is increasingly inescapable is the strong correlation between the rise in student and youth mental health issues and the advent of smartphones. A dominant means of communication, a communication that is hard for parents and teachers to supervise, that lends itself to conflict, that uses mysterious algorithms that companies aren't responsible for. We would not let companies serve our kids food without saying what's in them, but we allow social media companies to use mysterious proprietary algorithms to steer children towards more disturbing content to keep them watching, or more extreme content, or more violent content. The sort of operatically large emotions that sell and are compelling are peddled to young people for profit, and government doesn't seem to want to stand up to those companies. Giving parents the tools to limit and creating a kind of positive peer pressure to self-limit time on social media is extremely important. Making sure that we have recreational services and making sure that there are places where young people can gather and socialize as we were intended to is extremely important. There's no doubt that the levels of depression and anxiety, and it isn't just in Canada, it's happening consistently enough across all cultural lines that the one constant appears to be social media use. Those are two areas. Proper use of funding and making sure that we are creating a world where young people are getting the support they need. Our children shouldn't be learning emotional regulation from TikTok. And human interaction, especially parental and teacher interaction, peer interaction, those things remain vitally important, and they have to be addressed with some urgency.
Parental consent is required for many services students need. Whereas the need for these services can arise from home factors, how can the front line provide services if parental consent is denied?
That's an ongoing issue. In fact, there have been changes in the Child and Youth Wellbeing Act, for which I acknowledge the legislature and the government did good work in ensuring that adolescents can receive services based upon need. And again, I think that's one where eyes and ears on the ground are incredibly important. Uh, the advocate's office is always available if somebody sees that services aren't being provided based upon the child's needs. There should be a red flag, there should be follow-up. And in the end, the child's needs, the parent has an obligation at law to accommodate the child's need, and the child has a right to it, and the government has an obligation to provide the services. If that's happening, let our office know. Again, our process is confidential, and we can make sure that there's follow-up.
What are your thoughts on Policy 322, particularly with regards to its effectiveness and lack of funding?
There are a lot of cases where it has become too easy for politicians to proclaim support for broad principles without putting in the resources. And teachers are paying a huge price for that. When we went back in the Anglophone system to streaming beginning at grade 1, when we created classrooms where most 95 to 99% of kids from the poorest families with highest needs were in the same classroom, there was a promise that time saying, oh, no, we can do this, and we can have policy 322, and we'll find a way to have those resources. 10 years later, we just haven't seen a commitment to following up on that, have we? The department has a class composition study going on. It's been going on for a long time. There's no sign that it's at all integrated with any kind of budgeting process. In the meantime, the composition challenges have gotten more intense in classrooms. There's no question about that. We're seeing more learners whose first language isn't English or French in classrooms. We're seeing slower times for proper assessments, and the pressure is incredibly intense. The principle that every child should be included in the common learning environment to the greatest degree possible, and that when they are removed, it should be to get targeted help that is effective in giving them the tools to participate. Those are good, solid principles. They're the law. Frankly, they aren't even the law in New Brunswick. If you look at what the Supreme Court has said, that's actually the duty we have. There aren't a lot of ways, and that's part of the shared project we have with NBTF, is to create ways that, one, there are resources available for those sort of targeted interventions, and secondly, that teachers have a clear place to signal when the child is going to need more intensive interventions without feeling the kind of pressure that they could pay a professional price for speaking truth to power. Those are going to be essential. The issue is not that we should become less inclusive, it's that what we have done for a little too long is we allow politicians to give lofty speeches saying that we have an inclusive system, not make the hard decision to provide the resources to back up those words, and then kind of look the other way and say, well, when it doesn't all work, just do the best you can and then break the law if all else fails. And look at the outcomes right now, and we're seeing it. We are seeing a situation where in the Anglophone system, we've gone from over 80% of kids reading at level at the end of grade 2 to barely half of them. And that's happened in just 15 years. That is thousands more graduates who don't read every year. That's going to have a price. We used to have only at any given time 1 or 2 dozen kids on partial day plans. We're now over 500. And some of those seem to go on for months and months and months. The department says they're temporary, but when they were asked to define temporary, they said they didn't want to. That doesn't sound like leadership to me. We're seeing seclusion rooms. Used to be seclusion or the use of isolation as a classroom management technique was almost unheard of 15 years ago. Now seclusion rooms are part of the building standards for schools. It can't just be that the politicians get to give the lofty speeches, teachers have to deal with the problem, and then when it doesn't work, we just agree, well, no one wants to admit that, no one wants to deal with that, so just quietly break the law, send the kid home on a partial day for a couple of years until they quit school, or lock the kid in a seclusion room. But that's where we are. And it does come back to political accountability. Look, I think it's a wonderful thing that my kids were able to have French immersion in grade 1. They're the ones who were able to participate in that. I think it's a wonderful thing that we have an inclusive education system. But the folks who want to give the speeches have to find the resources. And sometimes, and this gives me a good chance to maybe address something, because I know it was part of the session before, and I sense it in the tenor of the question. It can be frustrating sometimes, and I know teachers who are already at the end of the rope must feel like, hey, gee, the advocate's office shows up and finds all these things wrong. And our goal is not to terrify people into taking children back into situations that are disruptive or violent or causing the other kids not to be able to learn. But our goal is to make sure that the people at the top are accountable for those decisions. If it becomes possible to simply starve the system of resources and not intervene when the child is small and can be helped, And then when exactly what teachers said would happen happens and the child escalates, we just disappear them into a seclusion room or a partial day plan until they quit, and then they show up as a troubled adult and it's someone else's problem. That's not going to be cool. We can't have that. And there's no incentive then for anybody to go back and fix the system. So we've got to communicate well. When you see children who are not getting the help they need early, let us know, because we can push for that to happen. When a child has not gotten the help they need, and the price of remediating it is going to be a targeted therapeutic intervention that's going to mean paying for an outside evaluation, paying for outside services, and it's more expensive, government's going to have to pay for that for what they failed to do earlier. And we are going to insist on that, because the alternative, just disappearing kids and hiding the failures of the system, letting politicians and senior leaders hide the gap between the rhetoric and the actual situation in the schools, isn't going to lead to change. And so we've got to communicate better, and we've got to hold people accountable. I think the question is absolutely right. In particular, resources are the issue, and holding the system accountable. Not just dumping the problem on the classroom teacher until they can't take it anymore, but holding people at the top accountable in a measured way for intervening early and bringing the numbers of cases down. That's something that has to start right at the top. And when we come, our job is not to make things difficult for the teacher, but it is to make sure that when a child has been failed by the system, the people who are in a position to prevent that have to answer for it.
How would the advocate address the issue that students who require an EA for academic support are unable to access one, since they are instead being assigned to students with extreme behavioral issues?
This is a frustrating one. I say this because I've recently seen documents where the department has been advised by districts that they are likely in violation of the Human Rights Act because they're not accommodating. Look, I would say two things. One, if there's a desire to reduce reliance on EAs to assist children, and there's in some cases that may be true. I'm not sure the inclusive classroom is a central lecture with 10 EAs in the room. But that can't just happen by cutting the number of EAs and hoping it all works out. There needs to be a careful pedagogic plan in order to look at different instruction styles. One thing that I would love to see done, quite frankly, is there was a pilot done about 16 years ago that found that by targeting class size reductions more intensely at the K-2 level, we could prevent a lot of issues later on. Children could get more individual attention. After all, let's be really clear. EAs do valuable and important work, but attention and focus of the classroom teacher and the application of their training and experience is also extremely important. Sadly, one reason why class size reduction, by the way, has been offered to target it more aggressively early on in order to spot problems and remediate them early. And some of those resources weren't always offered, but when they have been, sometimes the problem was union backlash saying, no, we just have to make them across the board, or we aren't willing to make those distinctions, even though the evidence is that smaller classes early on are far more important than, say, a top-level English class in grade 12, where students are a year away from participating in classes with 200 students. And so I think we all have a responsibility to look at how we might make sure that we're intervening early and more effective. So I think the focus on EAs is a function of a couple of things. One, EAs are a means of at least providing some control early on, or some assistance to control problems where other things failed and didn't get teachers and students the help they need. But it's also true that because of the strain in resources, we are increasingly seeing a focus on high needs behavioral issues at the expense of children that, as Frank McKenna used to call them, the severely normal, the child who might need a little bit of help. I remember asking one principal one time, saying, well, what happens if we have an 8-year-old who's really well behaved, generally participates in class, not a big problem, but they have an undiagnosed case of dyslexia? And the answer came, well, if they threw a chair, they'd be more likely to get help. That's not the kind of answer that happens in a functional system. And so I think the EA issue has in a way become a stand-in for an overall lack of early interventions, but we should all look in the mirror and say, what can we do in particular to make sure that children can get early help, early detection of problems, and that our classes are places where teachers are actually free to teach. And if that means sometimes doing things that mean we put more focus early, even if it's politically hard to sell in a union vote, or if we insist that politicians provide those downstream resources instead of just saying, well, let's cut and hope that motivates people to do things differently. I think we all have to look in the mirror and say, how can we do better? Because we can all see the trend lines. And on everything from keeping teachers in the professions to avoiding behavior problems, we're not doing a good job collectively right now.
How can we work to decrease wait times for students who need immediate access to services?
It's a great question, and I'll go back to that one. It is, I think, absolutely wrong that the failure to recruit school psychologists is used as an excuse to hold money back. That money should be available for private assessments and other services. Principals should have access to that money and they know the information they need. That change alone would be such a huge thing. And that, as folks are going to see in our upcoming report, that is going to be one of our priorities with government. If the money is budgeted and it's there for psychologists and you don't have psychologists, use it for something else. And withholding it to simply balance the books is not appropriate.
What are your thoughts on the decreased funding for libraries despite their proven importance for the development of literacy skills?
This is one I'm interested in hearing from teachers on that. There's no question libraries make a huge difference. Access to information makes a huge difference. I know that one thing that has recently been part, in fact, it was raised in I don't know if anyone's been following the news with the mayoral race in New York, but Zoran Mamdani, the candidate who came from nowhere to beat Andrew Cuomo and is likely the next mayor, has talked about following the examples of Scandinavian countries where books and other baskets are made available to parents each year. Access to books is a huge predictor. We know that not every child has an equal chance to learn. The literacy level of the parent is a predictor, but there are things that can be done to level that playing field. Libraries are another one. I know that certainly the public library that we go to a lot, I have a 2-year-old, and I know from the time we've had Molly participating in the Babies at the Library program, even the early exposure to holding books, to engaging with stories makes a huge difference. So I don't know what the best delivery mechanism is. I don't know, so I've yet looked enough to say with certainty as to whether school library assistants are the secret ingredient there or whether there's other ways that are more effective in doing that. I do know that early exposure to books and equalizing family literacy gaps are hugely important. Schools that I know back in the days when I was Minister of Education, some of the schools that had the biggest gains in early literacy, actually, we used to fund a number of positions with for family literacy, and they appeared to have a very strong correlation that when schools had literacy nights, when they brought the whole family in, sometimes after hours, when they provided games that could be played in the home, anything that looks at the family, because we can't just dump all our social problems on the schools and expect them to fix it. That's been a huge problem, I think, is teachers aren't off. We say we care about literacy and numeracy, but we don't always make it the focus, right? It seems every time a premier or minister has a particular bug about an issue, we go, well, the schools should teach that. Now they should teach financial literacy, or they should teach nutrition, or they should teach healthy living. If we get literacy and numeracy and problem solving right, then children are going to be naturally good at applying those skills to any number of life skills. And failing to do literacy and numeracy while then telling teachers to teach more and more complex life skills to make up for not having the basic literacy, numeracy, and problem solving skills isn't the way we run a functional education system. So giving teachers more time to teach seems really important, and recognizing that there's only so much the school can do. The more we can do, other departments, again, have to be part of that solution. But making sure that we lift up families and give every child an equal chance is going to be extremely important. Public libraries are part of that, but they're part of that for an even more important principle, that there should be universal access to reading and equal opportunities to develop a love of reading and the communication and exposure to books.
You alluded to this in an earlier answer, but what is the advocate's position on the epidemic of extreme behavioral issues and its relation to screen time addictions in children?
It is amazing to me that we have continued to not require social media companies to both disclose and regulate their algorithms. It's striking just how many studies show that look, all these companies have a simple commercial imperative: keep us watching. We even see that as adults, right? I'll bet your YouTube feed pretty quickly starts to reflect in a very scary way exactly what you've been interested in lately. I know every time I go to YouTube, it constantly has new 80s videos to show me or that kind of thing because it may know them, a Gen Xer. It knows the music I like. It knows what, and it's constantly trying to find ways to keep me watching. Facebook posts reels, all of which are now carefully calibrated to give you a 2-second preview and make you click on something that might be interesting and tell you how the rest of the story goes. They did a couple of studies that have stayed with me. One is young men who are looking even for basic things like health advice, bodybuilding tips, that kind of thing, are quickly referred to increasingly extreme content from, they go through Jordan Peterson and soon wind up with Andrew Tate and their referrals, because more extreme opinions are compelling. Sadly, a lot of American politics seem to be more on the idea that outrageous behavior is compelling, and therefore there's no incentive to show rational discussion. TikTok, there was an interesting thing where a child who has lost a pet will soon be inundated in their feed by being referred to other TikToks with people talking about dead pets, which after a while can't be real great for your mental health, but no one holds social media companies accountable for that. We can certainly at the schools, I think, and I'm sure, I know a lot of teachers are wrestling with this. Can we at least make children more aware of the manipulation that they're facing, that their interests may not always align with yours, giving parents public health recommendations the same we do for any other public health issue would be an extremely important thing for the Department of Health to undertake. We've recently had a project here at the office bringing together pediatricians and psychologists and others to see if we can assist in coming up with guidelines so parents know best practices. I've heard from some groups who are there to create positive peer pressure to try and have students choose and support each other in creating opportunities for interactions. All of this is important. We're past the point where we can deny that the correlation is there. The issue is, are we going to do something about it? And look, again, becoming a new dad recently and having a 2-year-old, I'm aware too, the greatest predictor for what my child does at this point is, what do I do? And there have been times I've had to look in the mirror and say, if I don't want my child to look first to her phone for entertainment, I've got to hold myself to that standard in terms of what I model. And just being mindful of that, I think, as adults and leaders is extremely important.
Final question.
Mhm.
One guest noticed that Kelly has the Blues Brothers on his wall. What's his favorite Blues Brothers song, and is the story of two troubled boys from a Chicago orphanage growing up to find their calling and save their childhood community through music an inspiration for youth advocacy?
Yeah, okay. I did the original one for my home office. I guess someone noticed I have Tom Petty, Gord Downie, and the Blues Brothers on the wall. The easiest one is favorite Blues Brothers song. Probably Soul Man for the music and Rubber Biscuit for the humor. I think maybe I don't know as though I want to say let's all. I hope that I hope that the Blues Brothers are a great role model for children. I think it was noble they wanted to save their orphanage. I think some of their methods might be more cautionary tale or best suited to the screen. I think one tip my grandfather always gave me that I think is such a good one. He said, remember, never try and live out your favorite songs or your favorite movies too seriously. But I will say that that music, like art and like any number of things, is something that lifts people up and is meaningful. And I hope children are exposed to things that make them laugh, and I hope they're exposed to music, and I hope they have a chance to find those things that they'll treasure when they're in their 50s. Anyway, thanks. It's a fun question. I'll just say, look, I think that is all the questions. I wanted to come back to that because it was, we're working with NBTF to make sure that we repeat this often. our office is not here to create any climate where teachers feel like we're coming in to make their lives difficult or to force them into situations that are not safe or are not good for other kids. Our job sometimes appears that way because it's our job to go back and say, where could the system have intervened earlier? And I understand that sometimes the problems are so immediate and pressing. And for all the right reasons, teachers are looking for a solution. Our job is sometimes to go back and make sure the system didn't fail young people. And that can sometimes make us seem interested in a broader set of questions than the very pressing and urgent one teachers have to deal with. But they are important because they're how we hope they're the only meaningful way we can make real change. So I would encourage teachers when you see something, and I hope the department does a better job soon of providing ways that you can speak out when you see a child not getting the help they need. But we do have a confidential process, and we are here to create and drive system-wide change. So hopefully we have fewer teachers put in situations where they're dealing with explosive incidents rather than doing the work that probably drew you to teaching in the first place, which is turning lights on in kids' heads. And just because we ask uncomfortable questions doesn't mean we're here to make people uncomfortable. We are here to make sure that the system learns when things go wrong for everybody and to make sure that the child's voice isn't forgotten. And look, I thought it was important to come back and make sure we answered every question there was. And I guess I want to end by saying, as someone who comes from a family of educators and teachers, I thank you for the work you do. I know it's tough out there, and I know it didn't get a lot easier. One reason we responded so quickly and pushed government to reverse some of the cuts in the last budget, and I hope it looks like our report had at least somewhat of a positive effect on that, is because we know how concerning the situation is in schools, and we want to be partners with teachers. Please give us information. If you see other areas and other departments or group homes that are failing kids who need it, let us know. We have a pretty good track record of getting our recommendations listened to, and we can be a tool if you give us the information to use. We can be a tool that will hopefully see the system respond better and leave teachers with far fewer of these pressures to deal with. So thank you for all the questions. I learned a lot from doing this, and I hope we do it again.